A single translation choice reshapes the meaning of the Jonah story. What begins in Hebrew as a great fish becomes in text and art something much more charged: a sea dragon. We know it as Jonah and the Whale, a staple of kids' books. The story of Jonah swallowed and vomited back out has made its way into popular culture. But the Hebrew text never actually says whale. More on why we think it's a whale in a future video. Instead, the story of Jonah describes a great or big fish. However, the Greek translation of the story chooses a word that means something far more extreme. The Greek translators of the Hebrew Bible used the word ketos, meaning sea monster. This is not the standard Greek word for fish. That would be ichthys. In the Hebrew text, the phrase is dag gadol, meaning big fish. There's no indication that the creature is monstrous or mythological or any other than a really big fish. This raises a problem. If the Hebrew simply says fish, why not translate it with the ordinary Greek word for fish? The question then is, why did Greek translators of the Hebrew Bible use a word meaning sea monster? This is more than a question of translation. It's a question of meaning. To begin answering that question, we have to look more deeply into the text of Jonah and other sections of the Hebrew Bible to identify linguistic and thematic connections. First, let's look at some linguistic connections. For example, the verb to hurl is used 4 times in Jonah chapter 1, as in verse 4. The same verb is used elsewhere in the Hebrew Bible to describe forceful, even violent action, such as when Saul hurled a spear at David. Another linguistic example in Jonah chapter 1 is the word row, found only 8 times in all of the Bible. It usually means to dig through a wall, except here in Jonah and in Amos chapter 9, where Yahweh speaks of the Israelites trying to hide from him as they dig into Sheol. Later, in Jonah chapter 4, God appoints an east wind, causing the sun to strike Jonah's head. The east wind is reminiscent of the mode of operation God used to split the Red Sea in the book of Exodus, where Yahweh turned the sea into dry land. Also, the language of striking the head recalls Psalm 74, where Yahweh is described as crushing the heads of Leviathan. Leviathan is the created sea beast, the personification of disorder in the Bible. These linguistic connections between Jonah and other Hebrew Bible books begin to create a network of allusions to a theme that runs through the Bible, which helps us answer our translation decision question. Jonah's language directs us toward a theme traced throughout the Bible: an encounter with chaos. First, there is the setting itself, the sea. In the Hebrew Bible, the sea is rarely neutral. It is often associated with anarchy, danger, and forces beyond human control. Jonah's story begins and unfolds within that unstable environment. That theme becomes explicit in Jonah's prayer in chapter 2. He says, "I called for help from the depth of Sheol. You heard my voice, for you threw me into the deep, into the heart of the seas." Here in Jonah's prayer, the sea is placed in parallel with Sheol, the realm of the dead. This is not simply a description of being underwater. It is a depiction of the place where dead people go. Jonah describes his experience using language that closely echoes other biblical texts associated with overwhelming waters and the threat of death, such as Psalm 42 verse 7 that says, "Deep calls to deep at the sound of your waterfalls. All your breakers and your waves have passed over me." And Psalm 69 verses 1 and 2, where the speaker cries out, "Save me, God, for the waters have threatened my life. I have come into deep waters, and a flood overflows me." Across these texts, the waters do not simply surround, they overwhelm, engulf, and threaten life itself. Closely related to the threatening, disordered sea is a pattern of descent. Jonah is described as going down to Joppa, down into the ship, and ultimately down to the roots of the mountains. This repeated downward movement reinforces the sense of engulfment and loss of control. Jonah's trajectory into the sea, into the depths, and into the creature follows a pattern found elsewhere in the Hebrew Bible, as we just saw previously in the Psalms, where descent into deep waters signals an encounter with chaos and the boundaries of life. A third element further develops the chaos encounter pattern through tradition of the sea creature. Texts such as Job chapter 41 describe Leviathan, a fearsome sea creature beyond human control. As already mentioned, Psalm 74 speaks of God breaking the heads of the sea monster. Isaiah chapter 27 presents Leviathan as a twisting serpent, subdued by divine power only. Within this broader tradition, this creature of the sea represents a force of disorder that only God can govern. Taken together, these elements, chaos waters, descent, and the chaotic sea creature, form a consistent symbolic framework. The sea is not just a setting, it is a disordered place, and the dominant creature within it is not mere marine life, but an embodiment of that mayhem. When Jonah descends into the sea and is swallowed by a great sea creature, his story begins to resonate with this same symbolic world. And this brings us back to the question of translation. Considering the text of Jonah, its language of hurling, rowing, striking, and the wind, and its theme of a descent into overwhelming waters, we arrive at one conclusion. The fish is a ketos. The Greek translator's choice now comes into focus. Rather than simply translating fish, they are interpreting the narrative, reading it within a Hebrew Bible context, but choosing a Greek word that best encapsulates that framework. In that sense, ketos names what the story is already doing. At the same time, the ketos was already a well-established figure in Greek visuals. Greco-Roman art gives us a clear sense of what a ketos was understood to be. It appears most prominently in depictions of the myth of Perseus rescuing the princess Andromeda from a sea monster. For example, on this vase, notice the aquatic-like appendages, its coiling tail and the protruding horns creating a quite concerned look on Perseus's face. This ketos from a mosaic found at the ancient Roman city of Colonia shares all the same features as the previous ketos, including the long snout and sharp teeth. In a fresco, now at the Met, the ketos rears its head out of the sea as it spews towards the chained Andromeda. These are clearly not naturalistic fish. They are imaginative composite creatures associated with danger and the unpredictability of the sea. When the translators of the Hebrew Bible chose this word for Jonah's fish, they were not introducing a vague term. They were invoking a familiar and highly visualized creature. That connection between word and image carries forward into early Christian art. Jonah's ketos resembles Greco-Roman depictions. In early Christian catacombs, the painted sea creature that swallows Jonah isn't a natural fish, but resembles its pre-Christian predecessors. For example, this fresco depicts an angry, snouted, open-mouthed creature rearing its head out of its watery domain, ready to swallow Jonah as he is hurled overboard. In another location in the same catacomb, Jonah is painted emerging from the dragon's mouth, much like a genie from a bottle. This time, the coiling, looping tail of the ketos is in view. Even in these simplified, two-dimensional forms, the visual language of the ketos is clearly present. In early Christian sculpture, this imagery is intensified as the sea creature is given three-dimensionality. Early Christian artists go out of their way to stress the creature's power and movement, reinforcing its identity as something more than a natural fish. For example, the so-called Jonah sarcophagus, named so for the emphasized twin ketia, displays some of the two-dimensional motifs, like the swelling, roiling tails. In a detail of another sarcophagus, Jonah reclines while the serpentine Ketos with wing-like fins lurks over him, baring its sharp teeth. Watch for another upcoming video where I'll explain why Jonah is rendered in such a laconic pose. Finally, in these two beautiful marble statuettes, now at the Cleveland Museum of Art, the unknown artist displays incredible skill in the finely sculpted, undulating tails that hover over Jonah as he gracefully dives in and emerges from the dragon's mouths. Though less serpentine and more dog-like than the other Ketia, it is obvious that this creature is no fish. These are not neutral or accidental renderings. They do not simply illustrate the Hebrew text. They are continuing the interpretive move already made in Greek translation, that the big fish is no fish at all. The story of Jonah does not end with its retelling in early Christian art. In Matthew chapter 12, Jesus explicitly invokes it, describing his own death and resurrection as the sign of Jonah. And notably, the Gospel uses the same Greek term, ketos. This is the word that shaped the translation of Jonah and the imagery we have seen carried forward in visual tradition. Just as Jonah descends into the depths and is delivered, so too the Son of Man will descend and rise again. But in light of this language, the comparison carries deeper weight. Jonah's experience is not simply about being swallowed and then released. It's a confrontation with death itself. And in the gospel context, Jesus positions himself as the one who was swallowed by Hades, only to emerge victorious over its power. As the Jonah narrative continues in later Christian art, the creature remains consistent for hundreds of years. It is not depicted as a natural fish, but as a hybrid, often monstrous sea creature, shaped by the visual language of the Ketos. As you look across these varied examples, the similarities persist, even as styles change. What begins as a translation choice becomes a lasting artistic tradition. The big fish of Jonah is remembered not as it was originally written, but as it was translated. For further reading, check out Scott Nagel's article, Jonah and Leviathan, Inner Biblical Allusions and the Problem with Dragons. It's not the easiest read, but he has many other reasons for why the Greek translators chose ketos for the Hebrew dog. For another worthwhile read, see Amy Erickson's article, Jonah and the Catacombs, Text, Ritual, and Magic in the Presence of a Biblical Prophet. Don't be intimidated by the title. It's actually a pretty easy read. See the description for links to these articles, and please subscribe to my channel and like the video.